Trump is threatening to close the southern border. Experts said that would cause an economic disaster. Well, it's a tough situation. I must admit, you can't ignore the fact that we have thousands of illegal immigrants trying to cross the border, and they are being emboldened by these migrant caravans because you've got people in this country advocating for them to come in, saying it's not a disaster, it's not an emergency. What happens? People in these countries are probably going to see one thing: a large group of people rushing the border, and some of them make it, which means you might not win, but this is your best shot. So it's a huge challenge. Now, I don't know if shutting down the southern border makes sense. I'm not an economist. BuzzFeed has drafted a story where they've talked to some experts who say otherwise. Here's the thing. It's really impossible to have like an objective story when it comes to experts. Because which experts do you pick? One pro, one for, like one against? That's a challenge. But there is a serious problem. I'll get to just a second. We'll read a little bit of this first. U.S. officials grappling with an influx of immigrants said Friday they are considering closing ports of entry linked to the U.S. and Mexico following a tweet from President Trump threatening to shut down the entire southern border or large sections of it if Mexico doesn't immediately stop all illegal immigration. Secretary of Homeland Security Kirstjen Nielsen told reporters on a conference call that the agency has already pulled officers from official border crossings to help contend with a surge of immigrants, a move that could lead to closures. It's on the table, Nielsen said. I will make a recommendation accordingly to the president. Nielsen said the U.S. hopes that working with Mexico to stem the flow of Central American immigrants making the journey to the U.S. and reallocating resources between the ports of entry will reduce the number of people they're seeing at the border. What the president is making clear is with these numbers, if we have to close the ports to take care of all the numbers who are coming in, we will do that. We are at a breaking point. At Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida, the president reiterated his threat to close the border. If they don't stop them, we're closing the border, Trump said Friday. We'll close it and we'll keep it closed for a long time. I'm not playing games. Mexico has to stop it. There's a very good likelihood it will happen next week. That could be huge. But this is bad news for Trump for one reason. He is going to lose the progressive millennial hipster vote if he does this. You know why? America would run out of avocados in 3 weeks if Trump shuts the U.S.-Mexico border. Think of all the starved progressive hipsters writhing in agony after not being able to have their $20 avocado toast. They'll never vote for Trump again. I'm kidding. They wouldn't vote for him in the first place, but yes, avocados will run out according to this story. Now, hey, I love avocados. I love me some guacamole. And I will be outraged. I also don't think this is true because I'm pretty sure we have avocados in Mexico? California. Why did I say Mexico? That's literally the point. We will lose the avocados coming from Mexico. Well, let's see. We got two takes on what's happening. I love the news. This is why I say it's really hard to be truly objective. BuzzFeed says economic disaster. Experts warn. And the Daily Mail says no avocados. Which is worse? I don't know. I think the economic disaster. From the avocados on avocado toast to the limes and tequila in margaritas, the U.S. is heavily reliant on Mexican imports of fruit, vegetables, and alcohol to meet consumer demand. Nearly half of all imported U.S. vegetables and 40% of imported fruit are grown in Mexico, according to the latest data from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Now, let's be real, though. It is a serious issue if Trump has to shut down the southern border. Whether you agree with him doing it or not, whether you think it's a reason. Look, the point is the president said and Homeland Security said we're spreading our forces thin to deal with this problem. And yes, we do get a variety of vegetables and other things imported. So that could have a huge impact on the cost of food at certain restaurants and things like that. While the avocado issue may be funny, let's read into why the experts cited by BuzzFeed believe this could be a serious problem. This month, agents are projected to apprehend more than 50,000 families across the southern border, the highest total on record since the U.S. began tracking the statistic in 2012. How is that not an emergency? We're at record numbers, and more migrants are coming. Earlier this week, U.S. CBP Commissioner Kevin McAleenan said the situation had forced the reassignment of 750 officers from nearby ports to the border with Mexico. The agency said are needed to handle the projected record number of immigrant families apprehended this month. Border Patrol has also temporarily closed highway checkpoints in its El Paso sector to deal with the increasing number of unaccompanied minors and immigrant families. Listen, I'm no Trump supporter, but I need a real argument from the left as to why it makes no sense to have a border wall or to have these resources. Listen, you want to talk about how we shouldn't build a $20 trillion big, beautiful 30-foot high wall? Sure. Okay, that makes sense. That seems nonsensical. But when Trump cites Customs and Border Protection and ICE saying, here's what we need, 200 miles of select fencing and an increase in resources like technology, okay, great. They're the ones saying it. It's not on Trump. Why deny that? Doesn't our law enforcement need resources? Okay, sure. Let's operate on the conspiracy theory that they're only saying this to support Trump's reelection. I just think that's nonsensical, especially when even BuzzFeed is talking about this. Check this out. Before I go on, unaccompanied minors. That's a serious problem. These kids, that's not safe. It's dangerous. We should do something about this. Disincentivize this. In February, more than 76,000 immigrants crossed the U.S.-Mexico border without authorization, more than 36,000 of which were families, a trend CBP officials have said have grown substantially in recent months and has stretched the system's capacity. That number includes people who entered the U.S. through an official border crossing without proper documentation and those who entered in between ports of entry. The number of people who entered the U.S. illegally or in between official border crossings was 66,000 last month. While CBP is seeing a record number of families arrive at the border, overall arrests are not at historic highs. Annual arrests along the nearly 2,000-mile southwest border are nowhere close to the peak of more than 1.6 million in the year 2000. In one of his tweets Friday, Trump said the U.S. loses so much money with them, especially when you add in drug trafficking, that closing the border would be a good thing. Experts warn that shutting down the southern border would, even just sections, would have a negative impact on the U.S. economy. When border authorities closed the port of entry November 25th between San Diego and Tijuana for several hours after a clash between Central American immigrants and Border Patrol agents, the San Ysidro Chamber of Commerce estimated that local businesses lost $5.3 million. Closing the border would be an economic disaster for the U.S. There is more than billions of dollars in trade that crosses the border every day, trade which supports 5 million jobs in the United States, according to a Wilson Center study, said Christopher Wilson, deputy director of the Wilson Center's Mexico Institute. So let's throw some challenges here. They're claiming it'll be an economic disaster. What about the costs coming from the enforcement of ICE within our borders, depressed wages, etc.? The issue of whether or not closing the border is going to be an economic disaster really comes down to, I don't want to say it really comes down to, but it's much more complicated than just saying the trade between the border is all we're looking at. No. It's more than that. What happens when these people come into the country and are detained and processed? What about those costs? What about the costs of some of these people, I'm not saying all, who end up committing crimes and the law enforcement burden? What about the tax burden? What about the school burden? There's more than just this one cost. And so, sure, you can claim that we're going to lose money in trade. I recognize that. We need a bigger picture here. Shutting this down from one day to the next would force many factories across the United States to stop their assembly line within days, cause produce to rot, and generally throw the economies of both the U.S. and Mexico into turmoil. I would only imagine certain aspects of the economy, keep that in mind. Yes, it's all intricately tied together and there are serious issues, but it is more complicated than that. Teresa Brown, a former CBP advisor who now heads immigration policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center, said the impact on closures would depend on which ports would be closed and for how long. To those communities, they are lifelines, she said, of ports of entry in border regions. They are essential. It would wreck the local communities depending on how long it is. That I agree with, and I recognize that. That makes sense, right? People are working on one side and living on another. There's business, banking as well, and imports and exports. Aaron Reichen-Melnick, a policy analyst at the American Immigration Council, puts the blame for the issues at the border on DHS, which he said had received billions of dollars for fencing and hundreds of millions for humanitarian processing. Rather than shoving children under a bridge, DHS should work with communities and organizations across the country to ensure that families get the support they need, he said. Well, I'll tell you what. I don't know what the solution is. I will say we've got viral photos of a bunch of migrants under a bridge in a fenced-off area. We've got, BuzzFeed said it was a record number since they said 50,000 families crossed the southern border. And that's 50,000 families. How many people per family? Are we talking about 250,000 people? Like, what does that mean, 50,000 families? Is that two parents and a kid, two parents, two kids? how are they determining the size of a family? It's got to be at least a parent and some kids, right? So at least 3 people. So are we talking about 150,000 people? Look, if BuzzFeed's going to say it's the highest on record, doesn't that constitute an emergency to a certain extent? I'd have to imagine it would. So look, I'll end by saying this. I don't know what the solution is. I don't. Don't ask me. I'm not an expert. But I think it's really weird that the argument from the left is like morality. It's like, well, can you address the cost and the migration crisis and not the morality of it? Because I don't know what you're talking about. Trump said ICE and CBP want this. Okay, what's your counter? It's immoral. That's not an argument, right? Whatever. I'll leave it there. Stick around. More videos to come tomorrow. I will see you at 10 a.m. Thanks for hanging out.